On the morning of September 19, 1944, Oberleutnant Klaus Richtor stood in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank. Scanning the fog-shrouded Bulge country of eastern France with growing unease, the 26-year-old veteran had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, faced Soviet T-34s at Kursk, and earned his Iron Cross in the hell of countless engagements. Nothing in that crucible of fire had prepared him for what the Americans were unleashing in the West. Machines so fast, so lethal that his fellow Panzer commanders whispered about it in the same fearful tones once. Reserved for discussing Katyusha rockets, they called it the Hellcat. RTOR's crew had first heard the rumors 3 weeks earlier near Nancy, a company of Panthers, 12 tanks representing Germany's finest armored engineering, had been conducting a tactical withdrawal when they encountered American tank destroyers. Within 17 minutes, 8 Panthers were burning wrecks, the survivors reported. Something impossible. Enemy vehicles appearing from nowhere, firing, then vanishing before return fire could be coordinated. One traumatized gunner claimed he'd gotten a solid hit on an American tank destroyer, only to watch it accelerate away at speeds that seemed to defy the laws of physics and warfare. The intelligence officers initially dismissed these reports as combat fatigue or exaggeration. Then the pattern repeated at Arras, at Luneville. At every engagement where American armored forces clashed with German panzers, according to After Action reports compiled by the Wehrmacht High Command, German tank crews were reporting enemy contact times averaging between 2 and 4 minutes before the American vehicles disappeared. The mathematics were devastating. In those brief windows, the Americans were achieving kill ratios that turned conventional armored doctrine inside out. The M18 Hellcat, as Allied intelligence documents later confirmed, represented a radical departure from traditional tank destroyer philosophy, where German Jagdpanzers and American Shermans prioritized armor protection. The Hellcat's designers at Buick, yes, the automobile manufacturer had been contracted to build it, chose a different path. They stripped away everything that wasn't essential to a single mission: kill enemy tanks and survive through speed, not steel. The result was a vehicle that weighed only 17 tons, mounted a 76mm gun capable of penetrating 4 in of armor at 1,000 wide, and possessed a 9-cylinder radial engine that pushed it to 55 mph on roads. RTOR studied the American technical manual his intelligence section had captured from a destroyed Hellcat near Metz, as referenced in the U.S. Army's official records from the European Theater of Operations. The manual specifications read like fiction: maximum road speed of 55 mph, cross-country speed of 35, a power-to-weight ratio that made it the fastest tracked armored vehicle in the war. His Panther, magnificent as it was, with its sloped armor and fearsome 75mm gun, could manage 25 mph on roads under ideal conditions. In the reality of war-torn France with its cratered roads and muddy fields, 15 was more realistic. The tactical implications were profound and terrifying. RTOR's Panther needed approximately 45 seconds to acquire a target, calculate range, and fire. Reloading took another 15 seconds if an M18 appeared at effective combat range, call it 1000 m, and his crew performed flawlessly. They might get off 2, perhaps 3 rounds, but the Hellcat's speed meant it could traverse that killing ground in under 90 seconds, fire its gun with the new American hydraulic traverse system that rotated the turret a complete 360 degrees in just 20 seconds, and be gone before the third German shot even left the barrel. 3 minutes, that was all the time German tank crews had. The story of the Hellcat began not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the panicked corridors of American military planning during 1941. Major General Andrew Bruce, newly appointed commander of the Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas, had studied the German blitzkrieg tactics that devastated Poland and France. He reached a controversial conclusion: the answer to mass panzer attacks wasn't more tanks or thicker armor, it was speed, firepower, and Tactical mobility concentrated in specialized tank destroyer battalions, Bruce's philosophy detailed in the tank. Destroyer tactical and firing sense doctrinal publications from that period contradicted conventional wisdom, where British and Soviet planners were building heavier, more armored vehicles. Bruce wanted something that could respond to enemy armor breakthroughs with devastating swiftness. His vision called for lightly armored, highly mobile platforms that would operate like naval destroyers, hence the name racing, to intercept and destroy enemy armor concentrations before they could exploit breaches in American lines. The development contract went to Buick Motor Division, part of General Motors' massive wartime industrial conversion. The project's chief engineer, a former racing car designer named J. Edward Campbell, approached the assignment with automotive rather than traditional military thinking, where tank designers typically started with armor requirements and added mobility as an afterthought. Campbell began with the chassis of a modified M24 Chaffee Light tank, stripped it down to save weight, and then asked his team a revolutionary question: how fast can we make it go? The answer emerged from the Detroit Arsenal in July 1943, the T-70 prototype, which would become the M18, weighed 17 tons compared to the Sherman's 30 tons. Or the Panther's 45, its Continental R975 engine originally designed for aircraft generated 400 horsepower when test drivers first pushed it to full throttle at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The vehicle hit speeds that made observers think the speedometers were malfunctioning, according to U.S. Army Ordnance Department records from that period. Engineers initially worried the suspension couldn't handle the stress, but Campbell's racing influenced design incorporated innovations borrowed from Indianapolis race cars. Buick began full production in January 1944 at its Flint, Michigan facility. The assembly line, converted from manufacturing automobiles, produced the first combat-ready Hellcats in March. By the time of the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, the first M18-equipped tank destroyer battalions were arriving in England. The European theater of operations would eventually receive more than 2,400 Hellcats organized into battalions that operated with an independence unusual in the rigidly hierarchical American Army structure. The crews selected for Hellcat battalions underwent specialized training that emphasized aggression and initiative. Unlike conventional tank units that operated in coordinated formations with infantry support, tank destroyer doctrine called for commanders to identify enemy armor concentrations, race to advantageous positions, engage from ambush, and withdraw before enemy forces could coordinate effective counter-fire. The official motto of the tank destroyer force, seek, strike, and destroy, wasn't mere propaganda. It was operational doctrine distilled to 3 words. Lieutenant Marcus Webb of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion experienced his first combat engagement in the Hellcat on August 12, 1944. During the American breakout from Normandy, his battalion had been positioned near Ardennes when German forces launched a counterattack with elements of the 2nd Panzer Division. Webb's platoon, 5 Hellcats operating as an independent unit, intercepted a column of 8 Panzer IV attempting to reinforce the German defensive line. The engagement lasted 11 minutes, Webb's after-action report, preserved in the National Archives World War II records collection, describes a running battle where his platoon used speed and maneuverability to dictate every term of the engagement. His Hellcat crew would race to firing positions on the flanks of the German column, fire 3 or 4 rounds, then accelerate away before the Panthers could bring their heavier guns to bear. When German tanks attempted to wheel around to face the threat, other Hellcats would appear from different angles, turning the engagement into a 3-dimensional chess match played at 50 mph. All 8 German tanks were destroyed. Webb's battalion suffered 1 Hellcat disabled by a thrown track, not enemy fire, and 2 crew members wounded by shell fragments. Sergeant Thomas Red Morrison climbed into his M18's turret on a cold October morning, 1944. Outside the French town of Briare, running through the familiar pre-combat ritual that separated professional tank destroyers from mere operators, the Hellcat demanded different skills than conventional tanks, different instincts. And Morrison, a former stock car mechanic from Georgia, possessed exactly the blend of mechanical intuition and aggressive confidence the vehicle required. The crew compartment was cramped, open-topped, and protected by armor that wouldn't stop anything larger than rifle-caliber rounds. The design philosophy was brutally simple: if enemy shells were hitting you, you'd already made a fatal tactical error. The Hellcat's survival depended on being somewhere else when return fire arrived. That open turret, which seemed like a vulnerability, actually provided crucial advantages. It reduced weight, improved crew situational awareness, and allowed for faster ammunition handling. In the close-quarters combat of European forests and villages, hearing approaching enemy armor before you saw it could mean the difference between ambusher and victim. Morrison's crew consisted of 5 men, each cross-trained on multiple positions. The driver, Corporal James Kowalski, could coax the Continental engine through terrain that would bog down heavier vehicles. His understanding of the Hellcat's torsion bar suspension system bordered on supernatural. He claimed he could feel the vehicle telling him where the solid ground was. The assistant driver, Private Danny Chen, operated the bow machine gun but spent most engagement scanning for threats and plotting escape routes. His job was thinking 3 moves ahead. In the turret, the gunner and loader worked in the synchronized rhythm that determined whether the crew lived or died. Corporal Marcus Washington, the gunner, had attended artillery school before volunteering for tank destroyers. He understood ballistics intuitively, calculating range, wind, and target movement in the seconds available. His partner, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, could load the 76mm gun in under 10 seconds, even when the vehicle was racing across broken ground at 30 mph. The 76mm M1A2 gun represented American industrial innovation at its finest. According to technical specifications documented in the U.S. Army's Field Manual 340 tank destroyer M18, the weapon fired armor-piercing rounds at 2,800 ft per second. At 1,000 wide, roughly 900 m, it could penetrate 4 in a vertical armor plate. That was sufficient to defeat the frontal armor of German Panzer V's and the side armor of Panthers and Tigers. The hydraulic turret traverse system borrowed from naval gun mounts allowed the crew to rotate the entire turret 360 degrees in 20 seconds compared to over a minute for hand-cranked systems in earlier American tank destroyers. But the real innovation was how Hellcat crews employed the weapon system. Traditional tank doctrine emphasized frontal engagements where armor thickness and gun penetration determined victory. Hellcat doctrine rejected this paradigm entirely. Morrison and his fellow commanders were trained to use speed and maneuver to achieve flank or rear shots where even the heaviest German armor was vulnerable. The Hellcat wasn't designed to slug it out toe-to-toe with Panthers. It was designed to appear on their flanks, kill them, and vanish before their companions could respond. The tactical doctrine developed through months of training and refined in combat followed a consistent pattern. Reconnaissance elements would locate enemy armor. Hellcat platoon, typically 5 vehicles operating together, would use their speed to race ahead of the enemy advance or circle behind enemy positions. They'd establish ambush positions with carefully planned withdrawal routes. When German armor appeared, the Hellcats would engage from the flank or rear at ranges between 800 and 200 m, close enough for guaranteed penetration, far enough to provide escape time. The critical moment came after firing. While German crews were still identifying the threat direction, Hellcat drivers would already be accelerating away, using terrain features and pre-planned routes to break visual contact. By the time German tanks rotated their turrets and prepared to return fire, the Hellcat would be 300 m away and accelerating 60 seconds later, it would be behind the next hill or tree line, repositioning for another attack from a different angle. Morrison had refined this ballet of violence through 15 separate engagements. His crew operated with the precision of an Indianapolis pit crew. They'd proven that speed wasn't just about the engine, it was about how fast you could identify targets, fire accurately, and execute tactical withdrawal. His personal record was 7 seconds from target acquisition to first round fired. In Hellcat doctrine, that was an eternity. Some crews were achieving 5-second engagement times. Headman Friedrich V. Burr sat in the basement of a requisitioned farmhouse near Metz, studying after-action reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of German armored operations in the West. As the intelligence officer for the 11th Panzer Division, Weber's job was finding patterns in combat data and developing countermeasures. The pattern emerging from these reports defied every principle of armored warfare he'd learned at the Panzer training grounds in Münster. The numbers told a story that German high command didn't want to acknowledge. In September 1944 alone, German panzer forces in France had lost over 300 tanks across all types, American M18 Hellcat battalions numbering fewer than 200 vehicles in the sector were credited with approximately 130 confirmed kills. The kill-to-loss ratio was approaching 8:1 in the Hellcat's favor. For an army that had built its reputation on armored superiority, these figures represented something more disturbing than simple tactical defeats. They suggested that fundamental assumptions about armored warfare were being invalidated by American innovation. V. Burr's analysis, portions of which survive in Wehrmacht records captured by the U.S. Army at the war's end, identified the core problem. German panzer doctrine had evolved on the Eastern Front, where engagements occurred at ranges exceeding 1,500 m across open steppe terrain. At those distances, armor thickness and gun penetration power dominated the equation. The Panther's 75 mm gun could penetrate Soviet T-34 armor at 2,000 m. The Tiger's 88 mm gun was lethal at ranges approaching 3,000 m. These vehicles were designed to fight and win engagements where they could be seen from a kilometer away. The terrain of Western Europe, the bocage country of Normandy, the forests of the Vosges, the narrow urban streets of countless French and German towns reduced engagement ranges to 300 m or less. At these distances, the Hellcat's lighter armor became irrelevant, while its speed and maneuverability became overwhelming advantages. A Panther that needed 45 seconds to acquire and engage a target simply couldn't compete with a Hellcat that could fire accurately in 7 seconds and be gone in 30, and the mathematics were brutally simple. In a typical engagement scenario analyzed by Weber, a Hellcat platoon would establish an ambush position along an expected German approach route. When German tanks appeared, the first indication of enemy presence would be armor-piercing rounds already impacting their vehicles. German tank commanders needed approximately 15 seconds to identify the threat direction, communicate with their crew, and prepare to return fire. The Panther's turret rotation speed, 15 degrees/s with the hand-crank traverse system, meant another 6 to 8 seconds to bring the gun on target. During those 23 seconds, the Hellcat would fire twice, potentially 3 times if the loader was exceptionally fast. Then, before German gunners could even get a ranging shot off, the American vehicle would be accelerating away. At maximum acceleration, the Hellcat could achieve 30 mph in approximately 12 seconds. By the time German tank commanders had coordinated their response, identified aiming points, and fired their first shot, the Hellcat would be 200 m from its firing position and partially concealed by terrain or vegetation. The German response time from first contact to effective return fire averaged between 120 and 180 seconds, 2 to 3 minutes. The Hellcat's exposure time in the kill zone was typically 35 to 50 seconds. The window of vulnerability where German forces could achieve effective return fire was essentially Non-existent, Weber proposed several countermeasures in his reports: wider spacing between vehicles to prevent multiple kills in a single ambush, prepositioned security elements to scout routes before main forces committed, coordination with infantry to flush out suspected ambush positions, more aggressive use of indirect fire, mortars, and artillery to saturate suspected Hellcat positions. Every countermeasure had been tried, none were particularly effective. The morning of October 24, 1944 brought freezing rain to the Vosges Mountains, where Lieutenant Marcus Webb's platoon of Hellcats from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had dug in along a ridge line overlooking the approach to St. Die. The weather was miserable. Visibility was poor, and that made it perfect hunting conditions. German armor trying to navigate the mountain passes would be channeled into predictable routes, their usual advantages in armor and gun range negated by the terrain and weather. Webb had positioned his 5 Hellcats in carefully prepared positions that exploited every feature of the ridgeline. Each vehicle had a primary firing position with clear sight lines to the valley road below, plus 2 alternate positions connected by routes that his drivers had memorized in darkness. The positions were far enough apart that German artillery couldn't suppress multiple vehicles simultaneously, but close enough for the platoon to concentrate fire on any target. Escape routes led over the ridgeline's reverse slope, where the Hellcats could break contact and reposition before German observers could coordinate effective counter-fire. Radio intercepts suggested a German armored column would attempt to reinforce positions further north. The division intelligence officer estimated a company-sized force, probably 12 to 15 tanks, likely a mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs. Webb's platoon wouldn't engage the entire column. They'd wait for the lead elements to enter the valley, destroy the first 2 or 3 vehicles to block the road, then focus on the rear of the column to prevent withdrawal. The Germans would be trapped in the valley, unable to advance or retreat, while Webb's Hellcat systematically destroyed them from positions the enemy couldn't effectively engage. The German column appeared at 7:40 hours, right on schedule. Webb counted 17 vehicles, 4 Panthers in the lead, followed by a mixed formation of Panzer and what looked like a couple of Jagd Panzerfers bringing up the rear. They were moving cautiously, which was smart, but caution didn't help much when you were channeled into a valley with poor maneuver room and enemies on the high ground. Webb waited until the lead Panther was directly below his position, perhaps 600 m away. At that range, the Hellcat's 76 mm gun would slice through the Panther's top armor like paper. He gave the fire command, and Corporal Washington sent the first round downrange. The armor-piercing shot hit the Panther's engine deck, and the tank ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its vents. Before the German crew could evacuate, the second Hellcat and Webb's platoon fired, hitting the same vehicle in the rear hull. The Panther erupted in flames. The other Hellcats opened fire in the coordinated sequence they'd practiced. The 4th vehicle in the German column, a Panzer IV, took a hit that penetrated its turret ring, causing the turret to jam. The last vehicle, one of the Jagd Panzers, was struck in the engine compartment and began burning. The German column was now trapped, unable to advance past the burning Panther or retreat past the destroyed Jagd Panzer. What followed was a masterclass in the tactical employment of tank destroyers. For the next 42 minutes, according to Webb's after-action report preserved in U.S. Army records, his platoon systematically engaged the trapped German vehicles. The Hellcats would fire from one position, then immediately displaced to an alternate position before German return fire arrived. The Germans attempted to organize coordinated responses, but the combination of poor visibility, confusing terrain, and the Hellcats' mobility made it impossible to achieve effective fire control. German tank commanders couldn't maintain visual contact with the American vehicles long enough to coordinate responses. By the time a Panther identified a Hellcat's firing position and rotated its turret to engage, the American vehicle was already gone, reappearing seconds later. From a completely different angle, the psychological effect was devastating. German crews were fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down, couldn't predict, and couldn't escape from. Ober Gustav Hoffmann had commanded panzer units since the invasion of Poland in 1939, survived 3 winters on the Eastern Front and earned the German Cross in Gold for his leadership during the retreat from Kursk. He'd faced Soviet armor in situations where tactical errors meant immediate death, developed instincts for armored combat that had kept him alive through 5 years of war, and trained countless young panzer officers in the brutal arithmetic of tank versus tank combat. The Americans' Hellcat forced him to question everything he thought he understood about armored warfare. His battalion had encountered Hellcats for the first time near Luneville on September 18, 1944. The engagement lasted 19 minutes and cost Hoffmann 7 Panthers nearly half his effective strength in exchange for 1 American vehicle disabled by a lucky shot that damaged its transmission. The after-action analysis revealed what should have been obvious. His Panthers were magnificent vehicles designed for the wrong war, or rather the Americans had invented a new kind of war where traditional Panzer advantages became liabilities. The Eastern Front had taught Hoffmann that armor engagements were about 4 factors: gun penetration, armor protection, crew training, and numerical superiority. German tanks typically held advantages in the first 2 categories. Soviet forces in the fourth and the third determined which side could exploit their advantages most effectively. This calculus had held true across thousands of engagements from Smolensk to Kharkov to Kursk. The Hellcat introduced a 5th factor that invalidated the traditional equation: speed as both offensive weapon and defensive protection. Hoffmann studied American tank destroyer doctrine through captured training manuals and debriefings of prisoners from Hellcat units as documented in Wehrmacht intelligence reports from this period. The American approach rejected every fundamental principle of German panzer doctrine, where German tanks advanced in formations supporting each other with overlapping fields of fire. Hellcats operated in dispersed patterns where individual vehicles acted semi-independently, where German doctrine emphasized holding ground and fighting from defensive positions. American tank destroyers treated every position as temporary, never remaining static long enough for enemy forces to coordinate effective responses. The most disturbing aspect was how American doctrine leveraged their vehicle speed to achieve consistent first-shot advantages. In Hoffmann's experience, armored engagements were typically decided by whoever spotted the enemy first and got off the first accurate shot. German optics and crew training traditionally provided advantages in target acquisition, but that mattered little when Hellcats were already in position, waiting in ambush before German forces even entered the engagement area. Hoffmann began implementing countermeasures based on his analysis. He reorganized his battalion to operate in smaller, more dispersed formations that were harder for Hellcats to ambush effectively. He emphasized aggressive reconnaissance, using infantry and lighter vehicles to scout routes before committing his precious Panthers. Most importantly, he trained his crews to prioritize speed of engagement over precision. Better to get rounds downrange quickly, even if they weren't perfectly aimed, than to take time for ideal firing solutions that would never arrive because the target had already vanished. The new tactics achieved some success. In an engagement near Chateau Sala on October 9, 1944, Hoffmann's battalion encountered a platoon of Hellcats attempting to establish ambush positions. His lead element spotted the Americans moving into position, a rare occurrence, and immediately opened fire, forcing the Hellcats to break off their attack before they could achieve their preferred tactical setup. 1 Hellcat was destroyed, another damaged, and the remainder withdrew. It was the first time Hoffmann's battalion had achieved better than even exchange rates against the American tank destroyers. December 1944 brought the coldest winter in decades to the Ardennes forest, and with it came Hitler's desperate gamble, the massive counteroffensive the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge. For The Hellcat battalions scattered across the American lines, the German attack presented challenges unlike anything they'd encountered during the pursuit across France. The Americans were on the defensive, German forces had numerical superiority, and the frozen terrain limited the mobility advantages that made the Hellcat so deadly. The 634th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, found itself rushed to the town of St. Vith on December 17, 1944. To help contain the German penetration, Captain James Thornton, the battalion's operations officer, watched from a hilltop observation post as elements of the 6th Panzer Army rolled west, the largest concentration of German armor he'd seen since Normandy. The numbers were daunting. Intelligence estimated over 200 German tanks in the assault waves heading toward American positions. The tactical situation was unprecedented. For Hellcat operations, instead of hunting German armor across the open countryside of France, the tank destroyers would fight a defensive battle from prepared positions. Instead of hit-and-run ambushes, they'd need to hold critical road junctions against overwhelming forces. The weather grounded Allied air support, eliminating one of the Americ's key advantages. Frozen ground made digging difficult, and heavy snowfall reduced visibility that the Hellcat's open turrets usually exploited. Thornton positioned his Hellcats to defend the critical road network converging on St. Vive. Each platoon received specific sectors to cover, with firing positions selected to maximize the M18's advantages in gun performance while minimizing exposure to German return fire. The plan called for trading space for time, allowed German forces to advance into prepared kill zones, inflict maximum casualties, then withdraw to secondary positions before German forces could concentrate enough combat power to overwhelm the thinly held American lines. The German attack hit Thornton's positions on December 18 at dawn. The assault waves included Panthers and Panzer IVs from elite Waffen-SS units supported by infantry and assault guns. The Germans advanced with the methodical precision of veteran units executing a well-planned operation, but as they entered the approaches to St. Vith, they encountered the same nightmare that had haunted German panzer commanders since Normandy. Hellcats appearing from unexpected positions, firing with deadly accuracy, then vanishing before effective responses could be coordinated. Staff Sergeant Raymond Cooper commanded one of Thornton's Hellcats positioned at a crucial crossroads south of St. Vith. His position overlooked a valley that German forces would need to traverse to reach the town. Cooper's crew had arrived the previous night, dug in their Hellcat, using the frozen ground to create a hull-down position that exposed only the turret, and prepared two alternate firing positions connected by routes they'd marked with white tape visible in the snow. The German column appeared at 6:30, a company of Panthers advancing formation with infantry support. Cooper let them close to 800 m, well within the 76 m guns effective range before opening fire. His first shot struck the lead Panther in the glasses plate, the armor-piercing round punching through and detonating the ammunition storage. The tank exploded spectacularly, blocking the road and forcing the following vehicles to stop. Cooper's loader, Private First Class Antonio Rodriguez, had already slammed the next round into the breech. The second shot hit the Panther behind the leader, penetrating the turret and killing the crew before the Germans could locate Cooper's position. His driver had the Hellcat moving, racing along the pre-planned route to the second firing position 200 m away. The entire engagement, 2 shots, 2 kills. Displacement to alternate position took 38 seconds.